Greetings and welcome to the final session of our long discussion of democracy and the politics of division and hate. What an interesting couple of weeks this has been, during which we've ended our seminar on democracy and the politics of division and hate. We've witnessed a highly divisive presidential election, which really put many of the premises of our democracy on trial. We've witnessed a long and unfounded attempt by the president's campaign to overturn the results of the Democratic election based on unfounded, without any evidence, claims of election fraud. And our democracy has survived this time. But it seems evident, and other observers are concerned about this, it seems evident that serious harm has been done to public trust in our basic electoral institutions, including especially the efforts by the president and his surrogates to ask state legislatures to annul the votes cast in their states and to send a different set of representatives to the Electoral College. What could demonstrate greater contempt for the rule of law and for the idea that in a democracy, the voters determine the outcomes of elections? These assaults by one party on the integrity of our electoral system have surely undermined the civic loyalty of large numbers of our fellow citizens. This is simply visible in the protests and the slogans and the chants and the harassment of election officials who refuse to bend to these assaults on their integrity. But it's not small numbers of people, it's large numbers of people who appear to have completely lost loyalty to our democratic institutions. And so the questions that we have spent the last several months studying and discussing are all the more important. We need to understand the underlying factors that have worked to undermine support for our liberal democracy, our oldest democracy, and the perceived legitimacy of our basic political institutions. That's one question we've asked. And the second question is looking towards the future. How can we contribute to making a stronger democratic society for the future? We have identified a number of possible sources of democratic discontent in the United States and in other countries over the past several months. We began with the most visible and kind of manifest content of right-wing populism and the deliberate efforts by populist politicians to stir up powerful emotions, social emotions of xenophobia, anti-immigrant feeling, racism, mistrust, fear, and hatred. So we have one theory of democratic discontent, which is based on the politics of division, very straightforward. But we've also been invited by Justin Jest and others to take a look at the economic system that has left some segments of our society, left some segments behind as a result of deindustrialization, globalization, outsourcing, and a race to the bottom with respect to wages and benefits for working people. There's a rising view that working people are being left behind, even as Wall Street and the very elite and the very high income segment of our society is doing better and better, richer and richer. And as much as straightforward economic and wealth inequalities are important, probably even more important than that are the substantial and visible inequalities of opportunity for oneself, but also opportunity for one's children and one's grandchildren. Opportunities deriving from access to high quality education, access to higher education, access to health care, access to decent living conditions, and living in crime-free neighborhoods. And I invite you to think of Youngstown as Justin Jest describes it. It's too bad we didn't have a video kind of just taking us through the mean streets of Youngstown today. Now let's consider some of the possible remedies which we have discussed in the course, both medium-term remedies and long-term remedies. We might consider, for example, a future for the United States or France or Germany where changes in income tax law substantially change and level the playing field so that everyone has to pay their fair share, including corporations, businesses, and the very rich. Secondly, we can imagine enhancements in the social safety net that ensures that working people are not ruined by economic hardship or by the steady grind of low-income jobs that have replaced better-paying middle-class jobs as a result of the forces of globalization and deindustrialization just mentioned. Not to speak of the current crisis created by the coronavirus. It's simply heartbreaking to think of the millions of people in our country today who are on pins and needles. Will the Congress pass a second round of financial support legislation to help working people get through the financial distress, the financial disaster created by the coronavirus? Third, we have talked about the importance of community-based organizations, that we can imagine a democratic future, a more multicultural and multi-religious and multiracial future for our society that has resulted from the cultivation of community organizations and faith-based organizations that facilitate cross-group understanding and collaboration. And this directly confronts the populist challenge of racism and fear of the other. Community-based organizations can address those impulses of social concern, social fear, and antagonism. And then finally, we've also talked about the importance of genuine policy efforts by parties to enact reforms addressing the issues and concerns of working people. Part of the discontent with democracy, as we've seen it through a number of authors, including populist authors, is the idea that the politicians are working only for themselves and not working for the common good. And in order to have confidence and loyalty in democratic institutions, it's really important that ordinary citizens, ordinary working people, believe that the party that they support, it might be the Republican Party, it might be the Democrat Party, it might be some other party, that the party is genuinely working to put together policies and legislative programs which work to improve conditions for the vast majority of our country. Then finally, we need to find, and you need to find, you younger people need to find, opportunities for genuine, impactful, grassroots involvement in political organizations that can lead to meaningful influence on the national agenda for legislation and policy. And this is important in two different ways. One is that young people can be very powerful engines for social change and policy change. But secondly, being involved creates involvement. So if one is involved in a grassroots political organization, one also begins to develop the feelings of attachment and engagement and excitement about being part of the solution for the future. It's worth remembering, and this is kind of the lesson of history, that social and political change only comes about through a very small number of possible mechanisms or pathways or trajectories. Some societies have seen a lot of social change as a result of just kind of gradual decay of institutions. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, or American presidents paid no attention and American economic institutions worsened for middle-class people and our political institutions decayed. That would be the gradual decay possibility. A second kind of social change that we've witnessed in the 20th century is rapid, substantial change enacted by an authoritarian leader. And we have all too often seen the example, especially in the 20th century, but now in the 21st century as well, of authoritarian leaders who promise big change, substantial change in pursuing an agenda. But there are two problems with that. One is the authoritarian is not inviting our feedback, our input on the kinds of changes that are being created. And then secondly, we have no reason to trust a dictator. We have no reason to imagine that the changes that he or possibly she undertakes will be the changes that were promised or the changes that are beneficial for most citizens. In fact, the opposite is most likely true. So that's the authoritarian change wing. The third possibility is really the only one that we could intelligently choose. This is democratic change enacted through the involvement of citizens and their representatives in pursuing a more satisfactory social, political, economic world for all of us. I think we can all recognize that the social institutions, political arrangements, economic arrangements of the world that we are currently a part of are not ideal. The fact that tens of millions of people have no health care, that's not ideal. We need to figure out a solution to that. The fact that there's a new term for this, but the idea that millions of people are now earning their living through Uber-like jobs. The new term is precariat. There's the proletariat, the working class working for an industrial wage, and the precariat is precarious workers working on an occasional basis. That's not a satisfactory economic arrangement for the people who are subject to those economic arrangements. And so once again, we need to figure out solutions which are just and which are enabling of the human potential of all of us, not just the most affluent of us. So if we don't want authoritarian government, either on the right or the left, Il Duce, Mussolini, or Castro's communism in Cuba, if we don't want either a right-wing or a left-wing dictatorship, then we must put our energy into making the democratic option work for us, work for the French people, the German people, the British people, the Dutch people. Or, as Benjamin Franklin said in answer to a question about the Constitution being adopted in 1789 or thereabouts, "What kind of government have you given us?" Franklin replied, "A democracy if you can keep it." This quote is really a fine ending for our course. The life of a democracy and a democratic people is a challenging one, and a circumstance that requires our effort, our concentration, and our loyalty. But it is worth it. It is better than the alternatives. Thank you, and I've really enjoyed the course with you, and I hope that you've found some very stimulating ideas from it.